Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Medtronic Facebook Live event. Over the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to spend some time with you to talk about the MiniMed 670G system. We'd love to take your questions. We're here and joined by Dr. Ohad Cohen, who's the Medical Affairs Director for Medtronic Diabetes, and also Rob Howe. It's a great pleasure to introduce Rob. Rob is joining us from the US and is currently using the MiniMed 670G system. So we would like to give you the opportunity to ask questions to Rob, and you can come and dial and put them into the Facebook comments at the bottom, and we'll take your questions as we go. Just before we do that, we're going to start by asking a couple of questions and introduce Rob. So Rob, I'd just like to ask you if you can give some background about yourself and your diabetes and how you came.
Yeah, sure. Well, first, thanks to Medtronic and to Andy and Dr. Cohen for having me here. It's a great day in Switzerland, and I'm here also with Europe's finest diabetes bloggers. So thank you guys for bringing me here from the US. So what's my diabetes story? I've had type 1 for nearly 14 years. It'll be 14 years on New Year's Day. So I was 16 when I was diagnosed, and I've been on pump therapy for about 10 years. And for the last year, I've been on Medtronic 670G, the hybrid closed loop system. So, I'm really excited to be here today. I'm very involved in the diabetes online community and throughout the United States with my podcast, Diabetics Doing Things. Very happy to be here today to talk about the system.
And you're a keen basketball player, right?
Yeah, once upon a time I was really good, and now I'm just not as good as I used to be. But age is a fun thing.
You still play though, right?
I do, yeah. And actually, more recently, I've been playing with the 670G system attached, which is something I used to detach my pump before I played. But now I tuck it into. I have a little pocket on some of my compression material, like on my game gear, and I wear it with the pump, so I'm on auto mode while I'm playing basketball, and just another thing I don't have to worry about.
Yes, so we'll come on. Many of you at home have asked questions around how you use MiniMed 670G with exercise, so we'll come on to that, Rob, and speak about that.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
I guess first of all, we'd like to start with we're extremely proud and happy as Medtronic Diabetes that this week we can say that we've started to introduce the MiniMed 670G system in Europe, which besides Medtronic, most importantly, it's a great occasion for yourselves and for the diabetes community as a whole. So Rob, if I start at the beginning about your when you first started to hear about the system and your diagnosis, so you said that what were you on before? What therapy were you using?
I was on pump therapy. I was on the Medtronic Paradigm Revel pump, so a little bit of an older model. I know many people have used that over the years. I didn't wear a CGM for most of the time with it. I started to use a CGM about 6 months before I started the 670. So I was familiar with the technology and I was comfortable with it. And I think a reason that I was attracted to the 670 as a pump is just because I'm personally interested in the latest technology. And when I found that all publication about AI and artificial intelligence and making decisions for you, and automation, I was really excited to try that for my diabetes. I've always been a big believer in if there's the latest and greatest technology, I'm willing to try it and adopt it early and try to be a part of that innovation. So I was really excited when I was able to get on the 670.
So then, starting with MiniMed 670G, then how would you explain it to someone that doesn't know anything about the product itself and the system? How would you explain it to people at home?
Yeah, I think it's a thing that you need to know as someone with diabetes. As we all know, you're going to get questions about your diabetes technology. So for me, I try to make it as simple as possible. So people are pretty familiar with like Fitbits and health monitoring devices for counting your steps and your heart rate and things like that. So I explain the monitor and the CGM first. So I have a device that checks my glucose every 30 seconds and then communicates that to my pump, which then tells it how much insulin to give me on a regular basis, all the time. And I think that's the simplest way to reinforce it, and then also to tell them that it's the first pump on the market that is approved to do that. And I think that's where I always get the biggest shocks from people, is that they think that these types of technologies exist, but when they hear that this is really the only one that's currently on the market, that's always impressive to them.
So for those of you that aren't aware at home, you've got the MiniMed 670G system that's here that Rob's holding in his hand. Maybe we can look at yours, Rob.
Let's look at mine. I think that one doesn't have a battery. So here we are. Here's mine. little bit high there, but that's life.
And then you'd wear this with a glucose sensor that you can see here. And what would happen is after that time, so MiniMed 670G system automatically adjusts basal insulin every 5 minutes based upon your personal requirements to ultimately keep you within a healthy glucose range. So it's responding to your personal needs. But Rob, if we talk at the very beginning about when you first heard about the system, how did you hear about this? Because your control was good, right?
Yeah, I think for me, and I think some people may relate to this, my control was good. So I had an A1C of 6.1 to 6.3, over like a year time frame, which I felt was successful. So my initial thought was, why would I want to change what I'm doing? It's working.
Yeah.
And then I started to look into 670, and I heard some people talk about the mental health aspect of thinking less about your diabetes. And so I thought, that sounded like something I would want to try out. And also, I think looking towards the future, when I was diagnosed 14 years ago, they said that the technology like this would be coming out in the future. And it's like we're living in that time now where all the things that they used to say were going to be released are now being released. So I had to make the decision and say, I want to be a part of that. And so, for me, as I was making those decisions, I thought I'm familiar with Medtronic pumps and supplies and how they work. I'm familiar with CGM. I'd like to figure out a way to integrate those, and so I started.
Yeah. So you mentioned time in range. So I'm going to ask Dr. Hacohen. So how would you explain time in range for people that are not familiar with this?
Well, that's a good question because, usually when you want to measure the goals on how good are you with your control, you are referred to what's called the hemoglobin A1C, which is a crude measure. It's not a direct measure of glucose, but gives you more or less the picture of the last 3 months. But it gives you a picture of the average. While for many, especially patients, it's not the average which is important, but actually the excursions, because you can be an average, but you have highs and lows. You're not going to feel as good as if you have an average, but you always time in target. So the idea is to move away from the average, which is the A1C, toward time in range, let's say between 70 or 180, which the patients feel comfortable and very secure without highs and without lows.
So for those of you at home, it's either 3.9 millimoles per litre or 10 millimoles per litre. So if we come on to yourself, Rob, and your time in range, was that something that you looked at before you went on to MiniMed 670G? Did you know about time in range? Were you looking?
I thought it was interesting because innately it made sense to me. The averages can be thrown off by when you're any sort of data range. Obviously, like you have your outliers and you have your trends, and I couldn't see what those were. And so I thought innately I'd like to know what my true measure of the range would be and how. Getting away from thinking of an average that factors in when I'm low and rewards me for over time for having lows necessarily, right? So I wanted something that was a more real-time accurate picture, and when I learned that was possible, I thought that was really cool. So time in range to me, I thought was really interesting, and I think I didn't check it though for the first really like 6 months. I wasn't something that I was actively thinking about, and then I was actually at another event, and someone asked a question about time in range and what that impact was like, and I checked it. And over the last 30 days, actually we did it today as well during one of the sessions here, and I was able to see over the last 30 days I had a overall time in range. That was my time in range was I think 78% over that 30-day period, and the only reason it wasn't because of some of the times I was off auto mode, and so for a total of that entire month I only had 2 hours where I was outside of the high range and only 40 minutes outside of the low range. So when I looked at that number, I think for me, like a total of 3 hours over 30 days where I was not in a target glucose range, and my range is 70 to 160. Yeah. So I'm not sure what that is in millimolars per liter, but I think that's a range that's more acceptable to me. So I could say, even if my A1C at my physician might be a little bit higher than it was before, I feel more confident making that decision because I know that for most of that time I was in a safe range.
So Andy, just to put this in perspective, the average of time in range in patients who are using insulin injections is around 45%. So 78%, your 78% is very good.
Yeah, and I think I also wasn't actively every single day trying to think about managing it, and so my mental burden was lighter, which is something that's very important to me because even though diabetes is a huge part of my everyday life, just with my management and also with my podcast and Instagram and being involved in the community, I don't like to think about it all the time, and so over time, I think thinking about it less for maybe 5 to 10 minutes a day over the course of a year, over the course of 10 years, makes a big difference.
Yeah. So I guess explain for people at home, we have within MiniMed 670G, there's two modes. There's manual mode and then there's SmartGuard Auto mode. So for those of you that are aware of use MiniMed 640G, you can still have those features within this, right, Rob, with manual mode?
Sure.
But then SmartGuard Auto mode is the new feature. So if I ask you a bit about SmartGuard Auto mode, how long did it take you to go into there? Can you talk a bit about the practicalities for people
Sure.
at home?
So when you first start on the pump, you start on manual mode. And I think you get some of the settings from the 640.
Yeah.
Suspend on low and those types of suspend before low,
exactly,
right?
Yeah.
And so you have to go 3 midnights on those modes before auto mode will be allowed to kick in. So it's sort of a strange metric, 3 midnights, but when I crossed into that 3rd midnight, my first day on auto mode was a very personally for me was an extremely stressful day for my family. We had my father was diagnosed with really advanced disease, and we had a surgery. So early in the morning, I was up, high stress situation, didn't eat for like 18 hours. And I kept checking my pump, and so I had the blue shield, I was on auto mode, and I kept checking my pump throughout the day where I wasn't eating, I was very stressed out, there's a lot of things going on, and I knew, because I'd been on a pump before, normally I would like crash low and I would need to get a snack or something just to keep keep my blood levels up in the right range, and it never dropped. It just stayed all day, it stayed like 130, and I thought like right then, I was like, wow, like today is a super abnormal day, very stressful. Most days are not like this, but I still was able to make it through that day without any extra treatment or care. And I felt like most days are not nearly this stressful and way more normal. I think I'm going to be just fine. So that was for me, having it like start on that day really helped me to say, okay, even on the worst days, I know that I can count on whatever this is going to evolve into.
Yeah. And Ohad, maybe to answer the question, you said 3 midnights. Why is that? What does the pump need to know and understand before?
Because although the algorithm on the pump will decide every 5 minutes what's the amount of basal insulin or a small micro bolus, it takes into account some of your characteristics that is gained from the previous use, like total daily dose and things like that, and how much the blood glucose in the morning. So it is adapting to your specific characteristics every midnight. So it gives you what you need at the moment that you need it, but it takes into account what is your situation every 24 hours and adapts to this situation.
And that's interesting too, because it's machine learning, right? And over time, the more you use it, the more it knows your specific profile.
Exactly, but at least every 24 hours at midnight, it readjusts according to what happened the last 24 hours, but it also looks like in the moving average for the previous 5 to 6 days. So there's a lot of smarts in this MiniMed 670G.
Are you okay with that though? Are you okay with trusting a device? And did it take you a while to trust? Because I don't know, for me it would be all your faith in a system. How did you find that?
So I'll answer this question because I think it's a question that we get a lot whenever some people ask on social media about diabetes management, because it's very personal and nobody knows your diabetes better than you. So, and that's because over the years you've been making minor adjustments and you've been learning things and how your body responds to certain activities and certain foods. And so I felt, again, like I was in control and I would be able to manage it. But what I learned was over the years on the other pump, without me knowing, just gradually over time, my basal rate had influenced the way that I calculated carbs. So my basal was correcting because it was maybe too high, too much basal, correcting for some and lessening some of my bolus, so my ratios were off. But I had no way of knowing that.
Yeah.
So when going on auto mode, I had to relearn how to count carbs, which was a little bit frustrating. And I got my first a very simple meal that I'd eaten hundreds of times, and had a hyper reaction after eating it. I was like, well, this doesn't make any sense. I gave myself the right dosage. Something must be wrong. And then I had to think about it some more, and I was getting the exact basal that I needed, and so my carb counts were off. So it took me a little while to relearn how to count some of my meals, and that, I think, for a lot of people is frustrating, because like you've learned over this a longer period of time how to treat your diabetes. And in those cases, I think a lot of people get frustrated and maybe want to go back to their previous therapy. But I would say for somebody starting, 6 weeks is a good. It's like it took me about a month, and you just get in and you learn it. Just like anything, change is hard.
Yeah.
And sometimes, especially because this is such a type 1 diabetics are very type A personalities, especially about their management. They take it very. It's a big challenge. It's a high priority for most people. And so it feels a little bit foreign to give that to a machine and trust it. But when you get gaining confidence, life is a confidence game. And if you go into a situation where you feel confident that your technology is going to make the right decision for you, overcoming those speed bumps and learning those in the beginning is instrumental to that long-term success. Yeah. So I think for me, the mistakes I made early on helped with the success that I've had after the first month.
I'm going to come back and ask you about what you'd say to yourself starting again in a second. But we've had quite a few questions that have come through, so thank you very much for that. So we've had a question from Alois Barkway that said, how long do the transmitters last for? So maybe I can take that one.
Please go ahead.
So the Guardian Sensor 3 is the new sensor, which I'll ask Rob to share his experience in a second. But that is up to 7 days in terms of the sensor itself. But in terms of what's been your experience, Rob, with the sensor? Because I mean, these questions have come through from various people to ask.
Sure. I think it's a great question. I think ultimately, as diabetics, we're always looking for how long or how many times we're going to have to change our sites, because that's what we deal with on a regular basis. I'd worn other CGMs. I like the Guardian sensor. I think I prefer to wear it up on my arm. Okay, and I find that that's where it can stay still and out of the way a little bit. And mine continually lasts the full 7 days. So I did have a few learnings early on, just like attaching it correctly. But once I got used to the process, I just changed my sensor this morning, and it took about 5 minutes. So really easy.
Yeah, I just wanted to add for the life of the sensor, the Guardian Sensor 3 has another addition, and it has a chip inside that checks for the health of the signal. So when it senses that it might not be as accurate, it might ask the patient or the people with the one with the diabetes to change. And that is because there's a lot of responsibility on the sensor, right? Everything is run by how accurate the sensor is. So sometimes it has shorter than a week, but that's because there is a reason to do it. And that's why you get this alert to change the sensor.
And I think alerts, as everyone with diabetes or who cares for someone with diabetes knows, alerts are, there's two sides of the coin, right? We love to have them because it tells us when we're out of range, high or low, but also they can be annoying in the middle of the night. But I think, Dr. Cohen, you said it best, the sensor is the key to the system. Yeah. And when the sensor is really working correctly and it's calibrated and it's communicating well with the pump, the system runs really, really well.
We've had a couple of questions about your glucose control, if you don't mind. So we had a question from Maureen McGinn and also Dave Sowerby. They've asked around, first of all, question one, their timing range is quite high. What would you say to someone that already has a high timing range? Because you spoke about flexibility and what you have. Yeah. What would you say?
Again, I go back to my own thinking of being having a range that was acceptable and that you're happy with. I think for me, you look at the life with diabetes. So it's not, there's no cure. You have to live with it for right now as long as the foreseeable future. So any breaks that you can get mentally and physically, I think add up over time. So I believe all of life's great treasures come from compound interest. So the compound interest of getting 10 extra minutes a day every day back are super worth it. But as with everything, changing your metrics. So I don't necessarily look at my A1C actually went up my first 6 months on the pump, but I looked at that time in range and I felt comfortable with where that was. And so changing your performance metrics, I think expectations are everything. I went into my pump switch knowing that my A1C could go up because of eliminating all my lows.
Yeah.
And that's what happened, but also I don't have the lows anymore. So a story I like to tell is an item on my grocery list was 2 half gallons of orange juice every week, just in case of lows. And I typically had overnight lows. So I would wake up in the middle of the night, pour myself a glass of orange juice, drink it, and then go back to sleep. But I had my first half gallon of orange juice go bad my first month on 670. Okay. So, and now I don't have that item on my grocery list anymore. So while my local grocery store is probably wondering why no one buys that orange juice, I have room in my fridge for other stuff now. So, and I don't wake up. I get to sleep through the night more often. I still have the occasional low, but I sleep through the night more often, which again adds less tired, less often, which is always a good win for me.
I'm sure you're looking at this because you're answering questions before I even get there.
Oh yeah, I'm in tune with the internet.
That was one of the second question from Dave Salby. So thank you, Dave. One of the questions was around HbA1c. About you said it's gone up. So we've seen in our clinical trials that OHAD can speak to that we saw a lower in HbA1c. But you said before that you've improved that time in range. OHAD, I'd like to ask you to just talk a bit about the difference between improving time in range, but also then dropping HbA1c. Which one should people focus on?
So what is more important, the A1C or the time in range? So just from a factual, A1C was a measure when we did not have continuous glucose sensing. So it's an approximation of blood glucose. Therefore, going to the time in range, giving more credency or more importance to the time in range is probably the metric of today. So time in range is important, but we also say time in ranges. So if you want to have a time in range which is high, you also want to have very low time in the low range. So to summarize and give a really straight answer, time in range and the 70 to 180, you want to have as much as you can, but with the minimum time in the low range. So if you have an A1C, but a relatively high time that you spend in low range, that is less a good outcome versus a slightly higher A1C, but more time in range, no hypoglycemia.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how this brand new product has really changed the way you look at a metric that a lot of people I think spend a lot of mental energy stressing over. I think for myself, I was trying to get approved for insurance at one point in my life, and I had to go for 18 months with my A1C within a particular range, and that was very stressful. For me, knowing every 3 months, diabetes is unpredictable. And I felt, like that was a little bit unfair, although I was able to, fulfill that and eventually get it. Looking now and saying, my A1C is in a range where I feel very confident of the high percentage of time in range and almost no time, 40 total minutes over 30 days in the low range. And I feel like that number is more indicative of my success with diabetes than any A1C would be. And yeah, I think we're just entering that age where there's going to be new metrics that measure how we're successful with diabetes. And I think that's part of what makes the technology so exciting to me. Not just what's here today, but what's continuing to come is that as I continue to live with diabetes from age 30 to age 80 and beyond, hopefully, I'm confident and I feel hopeful for what's coming next and the breaks that I'll continue to get from a mental perspective, from a physical perspective, and how that's going to impact my life.
So one of the questions we had added on to that, you said about your time in ranges. So MiniMed 670G works by targeting either 120 milligrams per deciliter or 6.7 millimoles per liter. For those of you that use millimole, is that one of the questions we've had? Is that target sufficient for you? I mean, the 120 for you.
Yeah, I think for me it is. I'm happy with, I think I was able to lower the edges of my range for the first time, which is something I didn't even think about doing. I think when I was on previous pump therapy, I would look at anything above 200 as a high, and I would adjust for that. And now anything above 160, I adjust. Yeah. So like cutting that down, and the percentage of that is dramatic. And it's just something I'd never even thought of before. And now my pump does all the thinking for me. So 120 works for me. If my blood sugar is 120 all the time, I'm going to be very happy.
And you said you learned about your basal and bolus rates, right?
Yeah, I think and correct me if I'm wrong, but ideally you'll have a 50-50 split, about a 50-50 split of basal and bolus is what is considered successful and the best way to manage. And I was more of at a 55-45 previously, which is not dramatically different, but now knowing that my rates are exactly 50-50, for the most part, I feel that's good. I feel like I didn't even know, and I think that's what's surprising about the new technology is that there are things I didn't even know I should be concerned about, and now I have the ability to just check them really quickly on my pump.
Thanks. So one of the questions we've had from Dina is she's currently using Animas and would like to know if they have a cannula with the pump still. So you want to know if you still use infusion sets, and we've got examples here. But
yeah, I use the Medtronic Paradigm infusion set. I like to have because I'm more active, I like to have the 45-degree insertion. I've used some of the ones, the vertical ones, the Mio, which is also really cool because it's easy to. I like to throw it in my bag. It's easy to switch out. But yeah, I still use actually the same reservoirs and infusion sets I used on my older.
So you can use
pumps.
the same. Yep. So hopefully that answers your question. One of the other questions we've had from us itself is that how do you track your glucose? Is there ways that beyond seeing it on the pump, do you look anywhere else? That's one of the questions we've had.
I'm notoriously bad about tracking them. I don't like doing it. It's boring to me, if I'm being completely honest. But I have used other apps, like third-party apps. There's a lot of different ones that people use. And I have used those in the past just when I wanted to take like a time. I took like 30 days where I tracked all of my sugars, and it was boring and difficult for me personally, but I got what I wanted out of it. So
maybe you can ask from a physician's side with CareLinks, the two reports that you can now see. It's improved.
First of all, you cannot say a greater good thing about a device that makes your blood glucose be boring. We want the blood glucose to be boring and not you to be bothered by the blood glucose. For the physician who's using the 670, actually there's a download which gives the physician, but also the patient, the same kind of a report showing the time in range, how much the patient is using the auto mode. So there are new ways to look at the data, combining all the community, HCPs, patients with people with diabetes, looking at the same reports and getting to the same conclusion on how to improve the glycemic control.
What is really cool about those reports is my doctor had never seen them. I was the first patient of hers to be on 670, so we reviewed the CareLink report, and you can see when the pump makes the adjustments based on the reading. I think that was the coolest thing, is like as your blood sugar starts to go up, you see your basal start to go up. And so like it follows it, and it's really interesting to see.
So I've had one question from Alan Rutland from the UK. It's asked about what the different levels of access to CGM. So we'll come back to you as a comment because it's UK specific, but to explain a little bit about the pump, there's different modes that you can use this in. You can use either the pump on its own, or you can start using manual mode, which is pump and either CGM and suspend features, or you can use the full SmartGuard auto mode feature, which Rob's just been referring to. One of the questions I did want to ask you, Rob, was if you look at the system itself and SmartGuard auto mode, many people have asked about exercise. You said you're a keen basketball player, you keep fit. You told me this morning you went for a run when you woke up. Do you adjust the pump? And can you explain a bit about some of the features in the pump that can accommodate to exercise?
Yeah, I think some of the more, that's all, diabetes and exercise is like the unsolvable equation, right? Yeah. It's because everyone's different. And every exercise is different, and everyone responds differently to different exercise. It's just one of the great gifts that diabetes gives you. So for me, I use auto mode for exercise, and like I mentioned before, I keep my pump on. because now I have the ability to put it in like a pocket in my tights, and it keeps close to me, so it doesn't feel like it's jumping around. And I keep it on auto mode. I know that some people use temp target because they want to keep their range a little bit higher, maybe for a longer run. So the types of exercise that I do are typically high intensity, like a high intensity HIIT workout or basketball, which is high levels of stress and adrenaline and cortisol, right? So my blood sugar typically would go up. So I love having the pump on and tracking my sugars while I'm exercising, because it slows that curve down. So instead of a big spike, now it just kind of goes up a little bit and levels off. And I also avoid that crash afterwards from a big correction bolus, which has been really nice for me, because I think there's so many reasons even people without diabetes find to not exercise. So when you get prepared for the gym and you go and then you have a hypo or a hyper in the middle of a workout, that can be really frustrating. And the 670 has helped me avoid some of those. And also on a long run, typically where I would kind of maybe after 5 or 6 miles start to see a trend downwards. I like having the auto to help manage my bolus to try to predict when those are going to happen. So for me, exercise-wise, can't say enough good things about it.
Thanks, Rob. So I guess my question to you, Ohad, is we spoke about the temp target.
Mm-hmm.
What is that for anybody that would understand?
So the set point for the target of the MiniMed 670G is 120.
Or
You
6.7, right?
Yeah. And you can change it temporarily until up to 24 hours to 150.
Yeah.
And that is for those who are actually doing a lot of exercise or very strenuous exercise for long term, anaerobic, or for those who actually are just starting exercise, even those who are not fit. So you might consider bringing a temporary target to 150 an hour before to a couple of hours after the exercise, just to make you feel more comfortable, and then adjust according to your own specific experience.
Yeah, and I know for, just to give specific examples, I have some friends who hike to mountains, and so a long strenuous, over a longer period of time, or in the middle of the summer, moving out of a house, carrying heavy things for a long period of time, and using temp target for that to help avoid any hypos.
We've had a question from Kate Sykes, so thank you again for that. One of the questions is, Sun currently uses MiniMed 640G, and I guess for you they haven't had that in the US, but manual mode for what you used, and maybe it's to you, Ohad, as well. They found that they helped prevent the hypos, but then there's a slight rebound in terms of the high for the glucose. And the question is that the same? Do you see rebound highs with MiniMed 670G?
So I did a little bit at first, and that kind of goes back to what I was speaking with earlier about my basal impacting the way that my carbs impacted me. So I found that if I was treating my hypos the same way I would on my manual pump, I would go a little bit higher. So I have to, again, go back to counting the carbs. Kind of had to go back to basics and do like 15 grams of carbs at a time and wait 20 minutes and test and make sure that I was right, which is, seems rudimentary and kind of taking a step back, but it helped me learn how to dose my corrections a little bit better. Yeah. So I do see some of that. But again, it's just all taking the new technology. There's a little bit of a learning curve.
Yeah. One of the questions we've been asked is about the age indication for MiniMed 670G. So in Europe, as I said, the first people we started to send the product this week to people in Europe. It's 7 years and above, but you also need to be using a minimum total daily dose of insulin of 7 units. Right, I've not said anything wrong. Okay.
8 units.
Yes, okay, good. So and I guess the one question is, do you still have to use correction boluses? We had a question from Jenny Anderton. You were saying to me earlier on about the control, but do you also have to take in correction boluses?
Yeah, so I think, and Dr. Cohen, make sure that I'm not, saying anything
we keep
that's
looking
compliant.
to not tell us off.
So for me, correction boluses are also another learning curve that were different, because I would test in my old pump, my manual pump, I would test, and then I had my ratios, my sliding scale that I would use. And sometimes those numbers are different when I enter my BG into the pump, my blood glucose into the pump. And I think there's a tendency as a person who is used to managing their diabetes to maybe what we call like a rage bolus, or a bolus that you would enter extra insulin and then not eat for. And I think I'm seeing some people like look at me and nod. So what I had to find is to trust the pump to give me that its ratios were correct. And sometimes they seemed off, and I was like, this can't be right. But it also you don't know as the user necessarily how much basal insulin it's already accounting for, or how much it will continue to account for over time. So I have made the habit, and I had to do this early on after a few mistakes on my own, to enter the BG and allow it to correct the BG rather than to bolus for food that you're not ended up not eating, because then you'll see those correction hypos. So enter the BG, trust that it's going to do the work, and that just takes a little bit of that learning curve again.
And be patient.
Yeah.
Sometimes it takes time for the blood glucose after meals to go back to normal. But if you push too much insulin, it might not go faster, but it will go lower and in danger. So the whole idea of the algorithm is trying to be as safe as it can and as efficient as it can. So be patient, put the blood glucose when you need to do a correction, and wait and see.
Patience is the crazy factor, right? I think human error is we always want it now, and that can be really difficult, especially. But I think you put it really well. It may not be faster, but you avoid the hypos after, which saves you time, and I think adds again back to that long-term view, not just looking at that exact moment, but the rest of the day.
So I've got a question for you, Ohad. There's two questions I'm going to ask at once. So first of all, thanks to Kit Harding and also Dee Dina. The question is more around people that are using in Europe MiniMed 640G. So you have suspend before low that we discussed. And also a question is, do you have to use CGM to be in auto mode? And then also, does suspend before low still work in auto mode? How does that work?
Very interesting and important questions. First of all, CGM is the heart of the algorithm. No CGM, no data coming in, no algorithm. So it is a system approach. It's a sensor, a glucometer, and the pump, and they work together as a system. Now, another important concept to understand when we go to the 670G, the MiniMed 670G, the hybrid closed loop, that there is no basal rate, right? Every 5 minutes, it's deciding by itself what is needed. Therefore, there's no suspend before low, because it's always detecting the blood glucose and deciding what is the basal rate. So in the 670, there's no suspend before low when in auto mode. But as mentioned before by Andy, you can choose a different mode which will act exactly like your 640G that you're already using today. When to use the 640G or when to use the 670G or the auto mode versus the suspend before low, it's a question that you can discuss with your health care professional, but most of the time you can see that the auto mode will bring you to the best results with this system.
So one quick question that we've had from Dee Dina, so thank you, is do you use dual wave and square wave? Do you still need to use them in Smart God Auto mode? Maybe it's...
I typically I don't use them anymore. I did like dual wave for things like pizza and Chinese food, which were always like those are my two biggest problems. You're laughing. Yeah, I mean, I think everybody relates to, seeing that orange chicken or Kung Pao chicken, like long-term spike. But I don't use them currently on auto mode.
Can I add just to say that in auto mode, you can only have a regular bolus. Because if, let's say, you do need to have a pizza, or
we all need to have
we all need you might need an additional extra bolus a little later on. What the algorithm does detect this, so after you do a regular bolus, it will increase, if needed, the basal rate to imitate a dual wave. So from practical purposes, there's only regular boluses that you use with the MiniMed 670G, but the correction is done by the automated basal rate that can compensate if there is a need for additional insulin post-meal.
So I guess to follow up on that, one of the questions we did have is around, do you change your insulin sensitivity factor still in your carb ratio? Do you still need to do that with MiniMed 670G?
Are you testing him or you're asking me?
I don't mind. I that's the question.
Well, I think it goes back to the 3 midnights thing, right? So you need to put all of your settings. Your pump trainer will go and review with your healthcare professional's recommendations for all of your carb ratios, which are in there, and I believe the machine learns from initially. And then I think also what was the second part we talked about? Carb ratio, active insulin, and I think that mine changed a little bit. But I think, again, I think you have to review those settings with your doctor.
Right. So the only thing that can be set on the pump when you're using auto mode is only the carb ratio and the active insulin time. The sensitivity index is defined every 24 hours, as just described so very well. So only the carb ratio and the active insulin time.
So one last question we've had is, if you could go back to yourself before you went onto SmartGuard Auto Mode, what would you say now? Because I've read and listened to your podcast. You're constantly learning, thinking forward. What would you say to people at home?
I say one advantage I didn't have, or not that many people had been on it outside of the clinical trial when I started. So I think now there's a lot of resources and tips you can learn from real people with diabetes who have been on the system, and I think that's what we all want as type 1 diabetics, is we want to hear what the users, what our people are actually doing and using. And I know Medtronic now also has a lot of resources available for how to have the best success. But the biggest thing is patience, and I think we talked about it a little bit earlier. Having patience with yourself. You're probably not going to get it right on the first day, and that's okay. And just learning and being willing to adjust the way you've been managing. And I think. Like we said earlier, it took me. I went in knowing it was going to take me a little while, but I think I'm always an optimist, and I think it's going to take me less time than it's actually going to take me. And I'd go back and say, it was the first 6 weeks I learned a lot, and it has really paid off long term. But if I had been really focused on my success in those first 6 weeks and said, I have to get this exactly right, I wouldn't have been so successful.
That just leaves me to say a huge thank you for you, Dr. Ohad Cohen, and then most importantly, Rob. It's been incredible to speak to you and very insightful. What we'll do afterwards, we'll connect you with Rob so that you can ask him any other questions afterwards. We've tried to get through as many questions as possible, and we'll come back to each and every one of you. But as we said, MiniMed 670G is now available in Europe starting this week. Please look at your local websites to ask. But once again, big thank you, and thanks.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.
When you have diabetes, people often tell you what you can't do. But at Medtronic, we're not inspired by can't. We're inspired by you. Which is why we created the MiniMed 670G system for the always multitasking, mountain peaking, homework crushing, adrenaline rushing, trailblazing, cello shredding, high-speed chasing, highlight reel making, incredible, unstoppable you. You're the reason we created the revolutionary MiniMed 670G system with SmartGuard technology. It automatically adjusts to your life, so you can spend more time in range, enjoying the moments that matter. Because when you leave can't behind, there's no telling where you can go next. The MiniMed 670G system with SmartGuard technology, inspired by you.